The new cook arrived with recipes no one had ever seen, and ingredients only she knew how to find. But when she served that special meal, something happened that doctors said was impossible. What the businessman didn't know was that this woman had come with a very specific purpose. Margaret stepped out of her beat-up Honda Civic and stared at the colonial mansion before her. The morning sun cast long shadows across the manicured lawns of the Beaumont estate in rural Virginia, but she could barely appreciate the beauty. Her hands trembled as she clutched her grandmother's worn leather recipe book against her chest. This job was her last chance, her last hope. Robert Beaumont opened the front door before she could knock. At 55, he still carried himself with the confidence of a successful businessman, but Margaret caught something else in his eyes. Something broken, something desperate. "You must be Margaret," he said, his voice carefully controlled. "I hope you understand that this position requires absolute discretion." She nodded, though her heart was already racing. Through the doorway, she glimpsed a young man in a wheelchair, and her breath caught. This was him. This was why she was really here. "Mr. Beaumont," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "I understand more than you know." The first 3 months passed like a careful dance. Margaret prepared meals that went far beyond simple nutrition. She watched as 28-year-old James Beaumont's eyes brightened when she served him dishes infused with herbs her grandmother had taught her about. Nettle for strength, ginkgo for circulation, and always, the special mint that grew only in the mountains during the full moon. Robert watched everything with the suspicious eye of a man who'd been burned before. Too many doctors, too many promises, too many crushed hopes. "What exactly are you putting in his food?" he asked one evening, cornering Margaret in the spacious kitchen. She looked up from grinding fresh turmeric, her hands stained golden. "Just spices, Mr. Beaumont. Things that taste good." But they both knew it was more than that. James was laughing again, really laughing, and sometimes late at night, Margaret caught him staring at his legs with something she hadn't seen before. Hope. The breakthrough came on a Tuesday in September. James was eating Margaret's special soup, the one with the wild mushrooms she'd foraged herself, when he suddenly went rigid. "Dad," he whispered, his spoon clattering to the table. "Dad, I can feel it." Robert rushed to his son's side. "Feel what?" "My legs." James's voice cracked. "I can feel the warmth spreading down my legs." The silence that followed was deafening. Margaret held her breath as father and son stared at each other, both afraid to believe what was happening. "It's probably just," Robert started. "No," James cut him off, tears streaming down his face. "This is different. This is real." That night, Robert called every neurologist he knew. None of them had explanations for what James was experiencing. The old scans showed the same spinal damage that had kept his son wheelchair-bound since birth. There was no medical reason for any sensation below his waist, but Margaret knew. She'd seen this before in her grandmother's time, in her great-grandmother's stories. Some things couldn't be explained by modern medicine. The tension in the house shifted after that day. Robert began watching Margaret with a different kind of intensity. Not suspicion now, but something more dangerous, curiosity, and underneath it all, a growing need to believe. "Tell me about your grandmother," he said one morning, finding Margaret in the herb garden she'd started behind the kitchen. She straightened up, brushing dirt from her hands. The morning light caught the silver in her hair, making her look older than her 42 years. "Why do you want to know?" "Because my son is changing, and I think you know why." Margaret's heart hammered against her ribs. This was the moment she'd been preparing for, but it was still terrifying. She was a healer. People came from all over the county when the doctors couldn't help. "And you learned from her?" It wasn't a question. Margaret nodded slowly. "Some things. Not everything. She died when I was 16. Robert was quiet for a long moment, watching her hands as she tended to the young basil plants. "Have you ever treated someone like James before?" "Not exactly like James," she said carefully. "But similar conditions, yes." The lie sat heavy on her tongue. She'd never treated anyone like James before because she'd never met anyone with his specific condition. But she'd studied her grandmother's notes obsessively, memorized every remedy, every combination of herbs and timing and intention that the old woman had left behind. What she couldn't tell Robert was the real reason she was here. The real reason she'd answered his job posting when she could have taken any of a dozen other cooking positions. Her grandmother's final journal entry had been about a little boy she'd treated 40 years ago. A boy from a wealthy family who'd been dying of a mysterious illness that no doctor could cure. The boy's name had been Robert Beaumont, and now his son needed her help. Margaret had been 12 when her grandmother treated that little boy. She remembered because it was the day her grandmother had made her promise something. "If you ever have the chance to help this family again," she'd said, "you take it, even if it costs you everything." The old woman had died believing that the Beaumonts owed them a debt, not money. Margaret's great-great-grandmother had been cheated out of her land by Robert's great-grandfather, forced to sell for a fraction of its value when the railroad came through. The debt was bigger than money, it was justice. But as Margaret watched James struggle to move his legs during his daily exercises, as she saw the desperate hope in Robert's eyes, she began to wonder if justice was what she really wanted anymore. The 4th month brought unexpected visitors. Robert's wife, Patricia, arrived on a rainy Thursday with enough luggage for a long stay. Margaret had heard about her from the household staff, the woman who'd left when she couldn't handle her son's disability, who'd been living in their New York penthouse for the past 5 years. Patricia was everything Margaret wasn't: polished, expensive, cold as winter rain. She swept into the house like she owned it, which she did, and immediately began finding fault with everything. "Who authorized these weeds growing in the garden?" she asked, staring out the kitchen window at Margaret's carefully tended herbs. "They're medicinal plants, Mrs. Beaumont," Margaret explained, trying to keep her voice neutral. "For the cooking." "Medicinal?" Patricia's laugh was sharp. "How quaint. Robert, surely you're not buying into this folk medicine nonsense." But Robert didn't answer. He was watching James, who was sitting straighter in his wheelchair than Patricia had ever seen him. His color was better. His eyes were brighter. Whatever Margaret was doing, it was working. "Mum," James said quietly, "I've been having sensation in my legs." Patricia's face went white. "What do you mean?" "I can feel things. Movement, warmth. Sometimes it's like electricity running down my spine." Margaret saw the exact moment Patricia's composure cracked. The woman had built her entire identity around being the mother of a disabled child, the tragic figure who'd sacrificed everything. If James got better, who would she be? "That's impossible," Patricia whispered. "The doctors say the same thing," Robert said. "But impossible things happen every day in this house now." That night, Margaret lay in her small room above the garage and listened to the raised voices carrying across the estate grounds. Patricia was demanding answers. Robert was defending her work. And somewhere in the middle of it all, she heard James's wheelchair moving across the hardwood floors of his room. He was restless. They all were. Change was coming, whether they were ready for it or not. The next morning brought the first real test. Margaret was preparing breakfast when Patricia cornered her in the pantry. "I know what you're doing," the older woman hissed. "You're taking advantage of my family's desperation. How much is this little charade costing us?" Margaret met her gaze steadily. "I don't know what you mean, ma'am. Don't play innocent with me. I've seen your type before. False hope merchants, preying on families like ours." Patricia stepped closer, her perfume overwhelming in the small space. "I want you gone by the end of the week. That's not your decision to make." Both women turned. Robert stood in the doorway, his face like granite. "Margaret stays." End of discussion. Patricia's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. "Robert, you can't be serious. She's filling our son's head with impossible dreams." "Our son is improving. For the first time in 28 years, he's improving. If you can't see that, then maybe you're the one who should leave." The words hung in the air like smoke after a fire. Margaret slipped out of the pantry, leaving the couple to their battle, but she could feel the foundation of the house shifting beneath her feet. Change was coming, and not everyone would survive it. 2 days later, James called her to his room. He was sitting on the edge of his bed, something she'd never seen him do without help. "Margaret," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I stood up yesterday. For 30 seconds, I stood up by myself." She sank into the chair beside his bed, her legs suddenly weak. "How do you feel?" "Scared, excited, confused." He laughed shakily. "Like I'm waking up from a dream I've been having my whole life. But what if this is the dream? What if tomorrow I wake up and it's all gone?" Margaret reached out and took his hand. It was warm and strong and trembling. "Some dreams are worth having, even if they don't last forever." But privately, she was terrified. Not because the treatment wasn't working, but because it was working too well, too fast. Her grandmother's notes had warned about this. Sometimes the body wanted to heal so badly that it tried to do everything at once. Sometimes that killed the patient. She'd have to slow down the treatments, space them out more. But how could she tell this family, who'd already suffered so much that their miracle might have to wait? And how could she tell them that everything they thought they knew about James's condition was about to change forever? Because tomorrow, she was going to receive the test results she'd secretly ordered, the ones that would prove what she'd suspected all along. James's paralysis wasn't genetic. It wasn't from birth trauma. It was from something much worse. Something that could be traced back to the very company that had made Robert Beaumont rich. The envelope arrived on a Wednesday morning, plain and unremarkable except for the medical laboratory's logo in the corner. Margaret's hands shook as she tore it open in the privacy of her small room. The words on the page blurred together at first, then came into sharp focus. Heavy metal poisoning. Specifically, a rare combination of pesticides and industrial chemicals. Chronic exposure during early childhood development. The damage wasn't permanent. It could be reversed with the right treatment. Margaret sank onto her narrow bed, the paper falling from her nerveless fingers. James hadn't been born this way. Someone had poisoned him, and she had a terrible suspicion about who. The next morning she found Robert in his study, surrounded by financial reports and invoices from Beaumont Agricultural Solutions, the company that had made his family fortune. He looked up when she knocked, and she saw her own fear reflected in his eyes. "We need to talk," she said quietly. Robert set down his pen and gestured to the chair across from his desk. "I've been expecting this conversation." "Have you?" Margaret clutched the test results behind her back. "What do you think we need to talk about? About why you're really here? About what you want from my family?" Robert leaned back in his leather chair, studying her face. "You're not just some cook who happened to answer my job posting, are you?" Margaret's heart hammered against her ribs. "What makes you say that?" "Because James is getting better, actually better, and the only people I've ever known who could do things like that." Robert's voice trailed off and his face went pale. "Oh God, you're her granddaughter, aren't you?" "Whose granddaughter?" "The woman who saved my life when I was 7 years old. Sarah Morrison. She lived in a little cabin up in the mountains, and my parents brought me to her when the doctors said I was going to die." Robert stood up abruptly, pacing to the window. "She had the same eyes you do, green like deep forest water." Margaret felt the world tilt around her. "You remember her?" "I remember everything about those 3 weeks. The way she made me drink bitter tea twice a day, the songs she hummed while she worked, the way she smelled like sage and lavender." He turned to face her. "She saved my life, and now you're here saving my son's life. That can't be a coincidence." The test results crinkled in Margaret's grip behind her back. "No, it's not a coincidence." "Why now? Why after all these years?" Margaret pulled the paper out and laid it on his desk. "Because of this." Robert picked up the medical report, his eyes scanning the technical language. She watched his face change as the meaning sank in. Shock first, then denial, then a terrible understanding. "Heavy metal poisoning," he whispered. "But that's impossible. James was born." "James wasn't born paralyzed, Mr. Beaumont. He was poisoned. Slowly, over years, starting when he was very young." Margaret's voice was steady, but her heart was breaking at the devastation in Robert's eyes. "The compounds listed in that report? They're all found in agricultural pesticides." The paper slipped from Robert's fingers. No, that's not possible. We've never used those chemicals near the house. Never." "Haven't you?" Margaret pulled out a folder she'd been carrying. "I did some research. Beaumont Agricultural Solutions supplied pesticides to most of the farms in this county for 15 years, including the organic farm where you got your produce. The one right next to the elementary school James attended." Robert stared at the documents, his face turning gray. The groundwater, the school well, contaminated for years before anyone noticed. By then, James and 12 other children in his class were showing symptoms, but the other families moved away. James was the only one who stayed. The silence stretched between them like a chasm. Finally, Robert spoke, his voice barely audible. "Are you saying I poisoned my own son?" "I'm saying your company made chemicals that hurt a lot of people, including James." Robert collapsed into his chair, his head in his hands. God, oh God. Patricia was right. This is all my fault. Margaret wanted to comfort him, but she couldn't. Not yet. There were still too many secrets between them. There's more, she said gently. He looked up, and she saw a man who'd aged 10 years in 10 minutes. My great-great-grandmother owned the land where your company's main processing plant sits now. Your great-grandfather bought it from her for a fraction of its value when she was desperate. She died penniless because of that sale. Robert's eyes widened. You came here for revenge. I came here because my grandmother made me promise. She said if I ever had the chance to help your family, I should take it, even if it cost me everything. Margaret's voice cracked. She believed in paying debts, all kinds of debts. And now you have. You've exposed the truth about James, about my company. You've destroyed everything I built. Robert laughed bitterly. Your grandmother would be proud. Would she? Margaret whispered. Because I don't feel proud. I feel like I'm watching a good man's world fall apart. Before Robert could respond, the study door burst open. Patricia stood there, her face flushed with excitement. Robert, you have to come see this. James is... She stopped, taking in their stricken faces. What's going on? Robert looked at Margaret, a silent question in his eyes. She nodded slightly. Patricia, sit down. We need to tell you something. The next hour was brutal. Patricia listened to the medical report with growing horror, then rage. When Robert explained about the contaminated groundwater, she launched herself at him with fury that 20 years of marriage couldn't contain. You killed our son, she screamed, pounding her fists against his chest. You killed him and then you made me live with the guilt. Margaret watched from the corner as Robert took his wife's blows without defending himself. The man who'd built a business empire was letting a woman half his size destroy him with her bare hands. Patricia, stop, Margaret said finally. This isn't helping James. Don't you dare, Patricia whirled on her. Don't you dare tell me what helps my son. You're not even supposed to be here. You're a fraud and a liar, and I'm the reason he's walking. The words stopped Patricia mid-sentence. Margaret stepped forward, her voice calm despite the chaos around her. Yesterday morning, James walked from his bedroom to the bathroom. By himself. No wheelchair, no walker, no help from anyone. He's been practicing in secret for weeks. Patricia's face went white. That's impossible. Is it? When's the last time you really looked at your son, Mrs. Beaumont? When's the last time you saw him as anything other than your tragedy? The slap came so fast, Margaret didn't have time to dodge it. The sharp crack echoed through the study, leaving a burning handprint on her cheek. How dare you, Patricia whispered. How dare you judge what I've been through? Margaret touched her stinging cheek, but didn't back down. I'm not judging you. I'm telling you that your son is healing. The question is whether you want to be part of that healing, or if you want to keep nursing your old wounds. Before Patricia could respond, they heard footsteps in the hallway. Slow, careful footsteps. Not the whisper of wheelchair wheels. The study door opened and James appeared, standing, walking. His face was pale with effort, but he was upright, holding onto the doorframe for support. I heard shouting, he said breathlessly. I thought someone was hurt. Patricia made a sound like a wounded animal. She took a step toward her son, then another. Then she was running to him, catching him as his legs gave out, both of them sinking to the floor in a tangle of arms and tears. My baby, she sobbed against his shoulder. My baby, you're standing. I'm trying, Mum, I'm really trying. Robert joined them on the floor, his arms around both his wife and son. For a moment, the family that had been fractured for so long was whole again. Margaret backed toward the door, giving them privacy, but James caught her eye. Don't go, he said. Please, we need to talk. All of us. The conversation that followed was unlike anything Margaret had ever experienced. Sitting in Robert's study, she watched a family confront 28 years of pain, guilt, and misunderstanding. James spoke first, his voice stronger than she'd ever heard it. I know what the test results say. I've known for weeks. Robert jerked as if he'd been struck. How? I ordered my own tests. I had to know why I was getting better. James looked directly at his father. And I know about the company, about what you've been covering up. The silence was deafening. I'm sorry, Robert whispered. God, James, I'm so sorry. I never meant for any of this to happen. I know. James reached out and took his father's hand. I also know you've been trying to fix it. The new environmental protocols, the cleanup efforts, the settlements with the other families. You think I don't pay attention to the business, but I do. Patricia looked between her husband and son, confusion written across her face. What settlements? What other families? Robert's shoulders sagged. 12 other children from James's school were affected, not as severely but still damaged. I've been quietly paying for their medical treatments for years, setting up trust funds for their futures. You never told me. You weren't here to tell. The accusation hung in the air until James broke the tension. Stop, he said firmly. Both of you, stop. We can't change the past, but we can choose what happens next. He looked at Margaret, and she saw something in his eyes that made her breath catch. Gratitude, yes, but something deeper, something that scared her. Margaret, he said, I need to know something. Did you come here to help me or to destroy my father? The question she'd been dreading, the one she still wasn't sure she could answer honestly. Both, she said finally. At first, I wanted justice for what your family did to mine, but then I met you and She stopped, struggling with words. I've never had a patient like you, someone so determined to heal, so willing to fight for every small improvement. Helping you became more important than hurting him. And now, Margaret looked around the room at the three faces watching her, a broken family trying to put itself back together, people who'd lost so much and were finally finding their way back to each other. Now I think maybe justice and healing aren't opposites. Maybe they can be the same thing. James smiled, and for the first time since she'd arrived, Margaret felt like she could breathe freely. But the moment was shattered by a sharp knock at the door. Robert's business partner, David Chen, stood in the doorway with a face like thunder. Robert, we have a problem. The EPA just served us with seizure papers. Someone leaked information about the contamination cover-up. His eyes found Margaret. Someone with access to our old files and testing data. All eyes turned to Margaret. She felt her carefully constructed world beginning to crumble. I didn't, she started. You didn't what? David stepped into the room, his voice cold. Didn't steal confidential company documents, didn't contact federal investigators, didn't plant evidence linking our pesticides to a dozen sick children. Margaret's heart stopped. I never contacted anyone, Then explain this. David threw a folder onto Robert's desk. Copies of internal memos, test results, correspondence with chemical suppliers. All of it allegedly provided by an anonymous source with intimate knowledge of our operations. Robert opened the folder, his face going paler with each page he turned. These are from my private files. Only 3 people have access to these documents. He looked up at Margaret. You, me, and Patricia, Margaret breathed. They all turned to look at Patricia, who was still kneeling beside James's wheelchair. Her face was calm, almost serene. Mom? James's voice was uncertain. Mom, what did you do? Patricia stood slowly, brushing dust from her expensive suit. I did what had to be done, what should have been done years ago. You called the EPA, Robert said flatly. I called everyone. The EPA, the FDA, the Justice Department, 3 different news outlets. Patricia's voice was steady, matter of fact. I've been collecting evidence for months, ever since I realized what you were hiding. Patricia, you don't understand what you've done. This will destroy everything. Good, she cut him off. It should be destroyed. How many other children are out there, Robert? How many other families are living our nightmare because you were too proud to admit your mistakes? The room erupted. David was shouting about legal implications. Robert was trying to explain about the settlements and the cleanup efforts. James was calling for calm. And in the middle of it all, Margaret realized that her grandmother's promise was being fulfilled in ways she'd never imagined. Justice was coming to the Beaumont family, not through her actions, but through their own choices. The question was whether any of them would survive it. The federal agents arrived at dawn 3 days later. Margaret watched from her bedroom window as black SUVs rolled up the circular driveway like a funeral procession. Men and women in dark suits emerged, carrying boxes and briefcases, their faces grim with purpose. She'd barely slept since Patricia's revelation. The house had been in chaos, lawyers coming and going, phones ringing constantly. Robert locked in his study, making desperate calls to senators and judges he'd considered friends. But it was too late. The story had already broken on the morning news. Beaumont Agricultural Solutions, a legacy of poison. Margaret dressed quickly and hurried downstairs. She found James in the kitchen, sitting in his wheelchair, but using his legs to propel himself around the island counter. The sight should have filled her with joy, but all she felt was dread. "How are you holding up?" she asked softly. James looked up from the cup of tea he'd been nursing. His eyes were red-rimmed, exhausted. "My father's company is being dismantled. My mother is being hailed as a whistleblower hero, and I can feel my toes for the first time in 20 years. He laughed bitterly. "I honestly don't know how to feel about any of it." Before Margaret could respond, Robert appeared in the doorway. He looked like he'd aged a decade in 3 days. His usually perfect hair was disheveled, his expensive shirt wrinkled and stained with coffee. "They want to interview you," he said to Margaret without preamble. "The agents. They have questions about how you knew to test James for heavy metal poisoning." Margaret's blood ran cold. "What kind of questions?" "The kind that could make you an accessory to Patricia's leak. They think you might have been working together from the beginning." "That's insane. I barely spoke to Patricia before she called the EPA." Robert sat down heavily at the kitchen table. "Margaret, they're going to want to know everything. Your real name, why you came here, how you got access to my private files." "I never accessed your files." "But you knew things. About the contamination, about the connection to James's condition. They're going to want to know how." James wheeled closer to them. "Dad, are you saying Margaret could be arrested?" "I'm saying that when federal prosecutors are looking for someone to blame, they cast a wide net." Margaret felt the walls closing in around her. She'd come here to fulfill a promise, to help a young man heal, maybe to find a little justice for her family's old wounds. She'd never imagined becoming a target herself. "There's something else," Robert continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "Patricia's lawyer contacted me this morning. She's filing for divorce, and she's claiming that I've been hiding assets offshore to avoid paying damages to the affected families." "Have you?" James asked quietly. Robert met his son's eyes. "No, every penny I've made has gone toward cleanup efforts and medical care for the other children. But proving that in court," he shrugged helplessly, "it could take years." The sound of footsteps in the hallway interrupted them. Agent Sarah Martinez appeared in the kitchen doorway, her badge gleaming against her dark blazer. "Ms. Morrison, we'd like to speak with you now." Margaret's legs felt like water as she followed the agent to the formal dining room that had been converted into an interrogation space. 2 other agents sat at the polished mahogany table, recording equipment spread between them. "Please have a seat," Agent Martinez said. Her voice was professionally neutral, but Margaret caught something else underneath. Curiosity, maybe even sympathy. "Am I under arrest?" Margaret asked as she settled into the uncomfortable chair. "Not at this time. We're simply trying to understand the timeline of events that led to our investigation." Agent Martinez opened a thick folder. "You began working for the Beaumont family approximately 6 months ago. Is that correct?" "Yes. And within weeks of your arrival, James Beaumont began showing remarkable improvement in his medical condition. He was motivated to get better. I just provided nutritional support." "Nutritional support?" Agent Martinez pulled out a photograph of Margaret's herb garden. "These plants you cultivated, several of them are known for their chelation properties, their ability to remove heavy metals from the human body." Margaret's heart hammered against her ribs. "I grow cooking herbs. My grandmother taught me that fresh ingredients make food taste better." "Your grandmother, Sarah Morrison, also known in these parts as a folk healer." Agent Martinez leaned forward. "Ms. Morrison, we've spoken to several people in the community who remember your grandmother. They all say the same thing. She had an almost supernatural ability to cure conditions that baffled medical doctors. People exaggerate, especially about things they don't understand." "Perhaps. But what they don't exaggerate is this. Your grandmother treated Robert Beaumont when he was a child. She saved his life when conventional medicine failed." Agent Martinez paused, letting that sink in. "Interesting coincidence that you ended up working for his family 40 years later." Margaret felt sweat beading on her forehead. "I needed a job. He was hiring. Were you aware that your great-great-grandmother's land was purchased by the Beaumont family in the 1890s? The question hit Margaret like a physical blow. They knew. They knew everything. My family mentioned it occasionally. Old family history. Old family history that resulted in your ancestor dying in poverty while the Beaumont family built their fortune on her land." Agent Martinez's voice sharpened. "That's quite a motivation for revenge, wouldn't you say?" "I didn't come here for revenge." "No? Then explain this. Agent Martinez slid a document across the table. Margaret recognized it immediately. Her grandmother's final journal entry, the one about treating young Robert Beaumont. How did you get this? We found it in your room during our search this morning, along with detailed maps of the Beaumont property, genealogical records of both families, and what appears to be a comprehensive medical file on James Beaumont's condition. Margaret stared at the papers spread before her. Her entire life, all her secrets laid bare on a conference table. I can explain? I hope so. Because right now it looks like you orchestrated an elaborate con game. Ingratiate yourself with the family, gain their trust, then work with Patricia Beaumont to expose their secrets and destroy their business. That's not what happened. Then tell me what did happen. Margaret looked around the room at the three agents watching her with professional detachment. These people held her future in their hands. One wrong word, one misunderstood explanation, and she could find herself facing federal charges. But more than her own freedom was at stake. If she was arrested, who would continue James's treatment? Who would monitor his progress, adjust his medications, help him through the difficult weeks ahead? My grandmother made me promise, she said finally. Before she died, she made me swear that if I ever had the chance to help the Beaumont family, I would take it. Help them how? However they needed. She believed in paying debts, all kinds of debts. Margaret's voice strengthened as she found her truth. Yes, I knew about the land. Yes, I knew she'd treated Robert as a child. But when I saw James's condition, when I realized what might be causing it, helping him became more important than any old family grudge. Agent Martinez studied her face. You're saying you diagnosed his condition based on your grandmother's folk medicine knowledge? I recognized the symptoms, the specific pattern of nerve damage, the way his body responded to certain treatments. My grandmother's notes described similar cases from the 1960s, when DDT contamination was poisoning children all over the county. And you didn't think to share this diagnosis with medical professionals? Margaret's cheeks flushed. Would they have listened to a cook with a high school education citing folk remedies from 50 years ago? Or would they have dismissed me as a quack and fired me on the spot? The room fell silent. Finally, Agent Martinez closed the folder. Ms. Morrison, we're going to need you to remain available for further questioning. Don't leave the county without notifying us. Am I free to go? For now. Margaret walked back to the kitchen on unsteady legs. She found James exactly where she'd left him, but Robert was gone. Where's your father? Conference call with his lawyers. They're trying to work out some kind of plea deal. James looked up at her with worried eyes. Are you okay? You look like you've seen a ghost. Margaret sank into the chair across from him. James, I need to tell you something about why I really came here. For the next hour, she told him everything. About her grandmother's promise, about the land dispute, about her initial desire for revenge that had gradually transformed into something else entirely. James listened without interruption, his expression unreadable. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. So you came here to hurt us, he said finally. At first, yes, I won't lie to you about that. But you changed your mind. I changed my heart. Margaret reached across the table and took his hand. James, helping you heal became the most important thing I'd ever done. More important than old family grievances, more important than justice, more important than anything. James studied their joined hands. The agents think you and my mother were working together. We weren't. I had no idea what she was planning. I believe you. James looked up, and Margaret saw tears in his eyes. But it doesn't matter anymore, does it? The damage is done. The company's finished. Dad could go to prison, and you might be arrested as an accomplice. Before Margaret could respond, they heard raised voices from Robert's study. The door slammed, and Patricia appeared in the kitchen doorway. She looked triumphant and terrible, like a warrior queen surveying a conquered battlefield. It's over, she announced. Robert's agreed to cooperate fully with the federal investigation. In exchange, he'll avoid criminal charges, but the company will be dissolved and all assets will go toward victim compensation. James stared at his mother. Dad's losing everything? Everything he built on lies and poison, yes. Patricia's voice was cold. But maybe now he can finally sleep at night. And us? What happens to our family? Patricia's expression softened slightly. That depends on what you want, James. I've been offered a position with the EPA, heading up their new Environmental Justice Task Force. It would mean moving to Washington. "What about Margaret?" James asked quietly. Patricia's gaze shifted to Margaret, and for a moment her mask slipped. Margaret saw something unexpected there, not hatred, but a kind of grudging respect. "Margaret can make her own choices. She's a grown woman." "I want her to come with us," James said suddenly, "to Washington, as my medical aid." Both women stared at him. "James," Patricia said carefully, "you don't need a medical aid anymore. You're walking. You're getting stronger every day. I'm getting stronger because of her. Because of her knowledge, her treatments, her belief in me." James turned to Margaret. "I know why you came here originally, but I also know who you became while you were here. Don't let my family's sins drive you away from the good you can do." Margaret felt tears burning behind her eyes. "James, I don't think that's possible. You've been telling me for months that impossible things happen every day." Before Margaret could respond, Robert appeared in the doorway. He looked defeated but somehow lighter, as if a terrible weight had been lifted from his shoulders. "The papers are signed," he said quietly. "Beaumont Agricultural Solutions is officially dissolved." Patricia nodded curtly. "Good. There's something else." Robert looked directly at Margaret. "The federal prosecutors want to meet with you again tomorrow, but not as a suspect, as a potential expert witness." Margaret's heart stopped. "What?" "It turns out there are dozens of similar cases across 3 states, children with unexplained neurological conditions, all living near farms that used our products. The government wants to build a comprehensive medical program to help them." Robert's voice was steady but sad. "They need someone who understands both the symptoms and the treatments. They want me to help other children like James. They want you to save them, the way you saved my son." The kitchen fell silent except for the tick of the grandfather clock in the hallway. Margaret looked around at the 3 faces watching her, Patricia with grudging approval, Robert with desperate hope, and James with something that looked like love. 6 months ago, she'd come to this house carrying her grandmother's old grudges and her own hunger for justice. She'd planned to expose the family's secrets, to make them pay for the pain they'd caused. Instead, she'd found something she'd never expected, a purpose bigger than revenge, a calling that could transform not just one young man's life, but the lives of dozens of children she'd never met. Her grandmother's promise had been fulfilled, but not in the way either of them had imagined. Justice had come to the Beaumont family, not through destruction, but through redemption, not through punishment, but through the chance to heal. 3 weeks later, Margaret stood in the kitchen of her new apartment in Washington, D.C., preparing herbs for the treatment protocols she was developing with the EPA's medical team. Through the window, she could see James in the small garden behind the building, walking without assistance for the first time in his life. He'd kept his promise to come with her, enrolling in Georgetown University's public health program. Patricia had thrown herself into her new role with the fierce dedication of someone who'd found her true calling. And Robert had moved to a small cabin in the Virginia mountains, the same mountains where Margaret's grandmother had once lived, where he was writing a book about corporate responsibility and environmental justice. The Beaumont family fortune was gone, dissolved into trust funds for sick children and environmental cleanup efforts. But the family itself was stronger than it had ever been. Broken apart and rebuilt, damaged and healed, they had found their way back to each other through the very tragedy that had nearly destroyed them. Margaret smiled as she measured out the evening herbs for James's tea. Her grandmother had been right about paying debts, but some debts, she'd learned, could only be paid forward, to children not yet born, to families not yet broken, to possibilities not yet imagined. The recipe for miracles, it turned out, wasn't written in any book. It was written in the choices people made when faced with their own capacity for both great harm and great healing. And sometimes, if you were very lucky and very brave, you got to be part of writing that story yourself.